The frost had already begun its cruel bite, clawing at the window panes of the parlor as Eleanor sat, the discarded engagement ring a cold weight in her palm. Outside, the world was a canvas of muted grays and skeletal trees, mirroring the desolation within her. Lord Ashworth's letter lay crumpled beside the ring, its formal script a brutal pronouncement of her ruin. His family, he'd written, could not countenance a match with a woman whose own father's venture had collapsed so spectacularly. Her dowry, once formidable, was now a phantom, and with it, her future. Eleanor, a woman of 20 years, was suddenly adrift in a society that valued property above all else. Her family, once pillars of the community, were now whispering subjects of pity and scorn. The chill in the room was not merely from the winter air but from the icy tendrils of despair that wrapped around her heart. Her mother, face etched with worry, presented the unthinkable solution. A remote tract of land, miles from any town, was being sold cheaply by a desperate man. A man who, in his own desperation, sought a wife, any wife, to stake his claim and help him endure the unforgiving winter. The terms were stark. A marriage of convenience, no pretense of affection, merely a means to survival for both parties. Her mother had spoken of him as destitute, a man with nothing but the wild land and the harsh promise of a new life. Eleanor had listened, numb. The alternative was a future as a burden, a spinster confined to the shadows of her family's diminishing fortunes, a quiet death of the spirit. The silence of the parlor was heavy with unspoken desperation. The journey west was a blur of biting winds and bleak landscapes, each mile pulling her further from the life she had known, a life that had now rejected her. She clung to a slim leather-bound book of poetry, its verses a faint whisper against the roar of the wind. When they finally arrived at the desolate, windswept shack that was to be her new home, she saw him. He stood by the makeshift fence, a silhouette against the bruised sky, tall and rugged, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He was Silas, the man she was to marry. His clothes were worn, patched, yet there was a quiet dignity in his posture, a stillness that was unnerving. His eyes, when they finally met hers, were the color of a deep, winter lake, remote, yet intelligent. There was no warmth, no welcome, only a stark assessment. She felt small, exposed, a sacrifice. The ceremony itself was a brief, utilitarian affair, performed by a traveling preacher who seemed as worn by the elements as the cabin itself. Silas's voice was a low murmur as he recited the vows, his hand rough and calloused as he took hers. It was not a gesture of tenderness, but of possession, a confirmation of the transaction. Eleanor's own voice was thin, barely audible above the howling wind that rattled the window panes. She did not look at him, could not. This was not a beginning but an ending. An end to her dreams, her identity, her very self. She was Eleanor Vance no longer, but Mrs. Silas Thorne, a woman tethered to a stranger in a land that seemed to despise life. Her heart was a stone, heavy and cold in her chest, but beneath it, a faint, flickering ember of something unnamed, perhaps simply the will to endure. The world outside the small cabin was vast and indifferent, and within it, she felt utterly alone, bound by circumstance to a man she knew nothing about, in a life she had never imagined. The first weeks were a study in stark, unyielding silence. The cabin, small and sparsely furnished, held the raw scent of pine and wood smoke. Each morning, Eleanor rose with the sun, performing the few domestic tasks required, her movements stiff with apprehension. Silas was a man of few words, his presence a quiet, formidable force. He spent his days outside, felling timber, mending fences, his movements precise and strong. She watched him from the window, a flicker of curiosity stirring beneath her ingrained fear. His hands, though calloused, moved with an unexpected grace when he carved a new handle for an axe or mended a broken tool. He seemed to understand the land in a way she never could, reading the sky, predicting the shifts in the wind, his knowledge of the wilderness profound and instinctive. He brought back game, taught her to gut and skin a rabbit without flinching, his instructions brief but clear. He showed her which roots were edible, how to gather fallen branches for kindling. It was a brutal education, far removed from the embroidery and piano lessons of her former life. Yet, slowly, imperceptibly, a new resilience began to take root within her. The despair, though still a shadow, no longer consumed her entirely. There was a quiet satisfaction in mastering a new skill, in the warmth of the fire she had helped build, in the simple sustenance of the food they shared. They ate in near silence, the only sounds the crackle of the hearth and the howl of the wind outside. He never looked at her with judgment, only a steady, observant gaze that held no malice, only an unreadable depth. One frigid afternoon, a fierce blizzard descended, trapping them within the cabin. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the very foundations of their meager dwelling. The small larder began to look increasingly bare. Eleanor felt the familiar tightening of fear in her stomach. "We'll be fine," Silas said, his voice low, steady, a surprising comfort in the raging storm. He spoke so rarely that when he did, his words carried an unexpected weight. He spent hours by the hearth, meticulously cleaning and oiling a collection of tools she hadn't noticed before: a compass, a sextant, intricate maps unfurled briefly, revealing names of distant, unfamiliar territories. These were not the tools of a common laborer, nor the possessions of a destitute man. There was a precision to his movements, a quiet expertise that spoke of a different life, one far removed from the frontier. Later, he pulled out a worn leather-bound book, its pages filled with neat, precise calculations and intricate diagrams. He sketched a more efficient design for their wood stove, his hands moving with an engineer's certainty. Eleanor watched, her mind turning over these small discrepancies. His knowledge seemed boundless, his quiet competence unsettlingly profound. He was a man accustomed to command, not of people but of principles, of the very elements he seemed to navigate with such ease. He offered no explanations, and she asked no questions. Their unspoken pact remained unbroken. But her initial perception of him as merely a desperate man, broken like herself, began to fray. He was broken, perhaps, but not destitute of spirit, nor, she suspected, of mind. A fragile trust began to form, not built on words, but on observation, on shared vulnerability against the vast indifference of the wilderness. She was still Eleanor, but a new, stronger Eleanor, forged in the crucible of this unforgiving land, under the silent, watchful gaze of a stranger who was slowly becoming more than just a stranger. The late winter brought a new, more insidious threat than the cold. A small band of opportunistic drifters, driven by hunger and desperation, had been making their way through the isolated homesteads, taking what they could. Word reached them through the infrequent visits of a lone trapper. Silas listened, his face impassive, but Eleanor saw the subtle tightening of his jaw, the glint in his deep-set eyes. He reinforced the cabin door, sharpened his axe, and moved with a heightened alertness that was almost imperceptible to an untrained eye. Eleanor found herself watching him, not with fear, but with a strange, nascent sense of reliance. The world outside felt closer now, its dangers more tangible. One evening, as the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, a distant flicker of a campfire caught Silas's attention. He extinguished their own lamp, plunging the cabin into a near-total darkness, illuminated only by the faint glow of the embers in the hearth. He handed Eleanor a loaded rifle, her hands trembling as she took the cold metal. "If they come," he whispered, his voice a low thrum against her ear. "You stay by the window, aim for their legs if they try the door." His breath was warm on her cheek, a stark contrast to the terror that seized her. He didn't ask if she could shoot, only gave the instruction, an implicit trust in her burgeoning resolve. He then moved silently to the other side of the cabin, a shadow blending with the deeper shadows. The wait was an eternity of strained nerves and pounding heartbeats. She heard the soft crunch of snow outside, then hushed whispers. A shadow fell across the frosted window pane. Eleanor lifted the rifle, her arms surprisingly steady. The lessons from her father's shooting range, long dismissed as unfeminine, suddenly resurfacing. Just as the shadow shifted, a loud, guttural cry tore through the night, followed by the unmistakable sound of a struggle. Silas had moved, swift as a phantom. There were grunts, the thud of bodies, and then an eerie silence. Eleanor strained her ears, gripping the rifle. Then Silas was back, his figure appearing out of the darkness, a dark stain on his coat. "They won't bother us again," he said, his voice low and devoid of triumph, merely a statement of fact. He took the rifle from her, his fingers brushing hers, a fleeting contact that sent a strange current through her. The air was thick with the scent of pine and something else, iron, faintly. He moved to the hearth, adding logs to the dwindling fire, his movements calm, deliberate. Eleanor watched him, the full weight of what had transpired settling upon her. He had protected her without hesitation, without a word of self-congratulation. In the flickering light, she saw a long, jagged scar bisecting his left eyebrow, a testament to past battles. He was not merely a simple man of the land. He was a man of action, of quiet, formidable strength. The terror began to recede, replaced by a profound sense of awe and something akin to a fragile, burgeoning respect. This was the true nature of their partnership, forged not in pleasantries or shared pasts, but in shared danger, in an unspoken primal understanding. The cold still seeped into the cabin, but the coldness in her heart had begun to melt. The morning after the ordeal, a quiet calm had settled over the cabin, though the lingering scent of smoke and something metallic hinted at the previous night's violence. Silas moved with his usual measured pace, but Eleanor saw the slight stiffness in his shoulder, the careful way he favored his left arm. He didn't speak of it, and she didn't ask. Their communication had long since transcended words, a language of glances, shared tasks, and unspoken understanding. As Eleanor prepared their simple breakfast, a distant sound caught her ear, the rhythmic thud of horses' hooves, approaching at speed. It was too many for the lone trapper, too purposeful for common travelers. Silas went rigid, his gaze fixed on the window. A moment later, a small procession arrived. 2 riders impeccably dressed despite the rugged terrain, their mounts well-bred and finely groomed. They dismounted with a practiced ease, their eyes scanning the cabin, then settling on Silas. Eleanor felt a jolt of apprehension. These were not men from this world. One, a man with a neatly trimmed beard and a stern countenance, stepped forward. "Mr. Thorne," he stated, his voice carrying the distinct accent of the eastern cities, a sound so foreign here. "We've been searching for you for weeks. Your brother sends his most urgent regards." Silas simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. There was no surprise in his eyes, only a quiet resignation. He looked at Eleanor, a fleeting, almost imperceptible shift in his gaze. "These are associates," he said, his voice calm, but with an underlying current that Eleanor had never heard before in authority. A quiet command that had nothing to do with felling trees or hunting game. The bearded man produced a thick envelope, its contents rustling with papers and, Eleanor suspected, substantial currency. "Your holdings, sir, have seen an extraordinary surge. The Railroad Consortium has finalized the acquisition of the northern land tracts you advised." Eleanor stood frozen, the skillet forgotten in her hand. The words echoed in her mind. Holdings, acquisition, Railroad Consortium. This was not the language of the destitute. The pieces of the puzzle, scattered like embers in the hearth, began to coalesce. The fine tools, the meticulous maps, the complex calculations, the uncanny knowledge of the land, the air of quiet command, the way he carried himself not as a broken man but as a man who chose to be broken, perhaps, or merely absent. He was not destitute. He was not a simple frontiersman. He was Silas Thorne, a man of significant means, perhaps even a tycoon, who had, for reasons unknown, retreated to this desolate corner of the world. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not the rough-hewn stranger she had married out of desperation, but a man of immense depth and complexity, a man who had chosen to reveal only what was necessary for survival. Her engagement had been called off due to a lack of fortune, and she had married a man she believed had nothing, only to find he possessed more than she could ever have imagined. Yet, the revelation brought no joy from the material wealth. Instead, a profound quietude settled within her. The true currency of their union was not gold, but shared struggle, unspoken understanding, and the fierce, quiet bond forged in the crucible of this harsh land. Later, after the associates had departed, leaving behind an unsettling silence, Eleanor turned to Silas. He was by the window, gazing out at the vast, snow-covered landscape. "You never told me," she said, her voice soft, devoid of accusation. He turned, his winter-lake eyes meeting hers. "It wasn't relevant," he replied, his voice a low murmur. "You married a man who needed a wife to survive. The rest was merely a circumstance of the world I chose to leave behind." He paused, then added, "It is still a choice," he was giving her one too. Eleanor looked out at the world, no longer a desolate landscape of despair, but a canvas of possibility. She had come here broken, consumed by fear and loneliness. Now she stood tall, forged by hardship, resilient, capable. She had found dignity not in society's approval, but in her own strength, in the quiet, profound partnership with this enigmatic man. The truth of his wealth changed nothing of who he was to her, nor who she had become. The engagement had been called off, leading her to a man who, unbeknownst to her, was a mysterious tycoon. But the wealth she had gained was far more valuable. A quiet, unwavering strength, and a bond forged in true necessity, not false pretense. Her future was no longer dictated by circumstance, but by the quiet, resilient strength of her own choosing, standing beside a man who saw her not for what she possessed, but for who she truly was. The winter still held the land in its grip, but in the cabin, a gentle optimism, a new kind of warmth had begun to bloom.